From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there and welcome to Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis on yet another program here on Can TV. So the impasse has kind of become a quagmire, hasn't it? And as Springfield and City Hall slip closer and closer to just about all-out fiscal chaos, the search is on for victims and for culprits. Just who's to blame for this mess and who's gonna pay? Spoiler alert, we already know it's you. But it's funny how when the Rowners and the Emanuels and the Cullertons and the Madigans all get around arguing about how much that teacher with the $40K pension is going to have to lose, or how many substance abuse clinics have to close, or exactly how much more property taxes we'll all have to pay, there's one sector that's never in that line for the haircut, and it's the folks who more than any other really did cause this collapse. So today, we're going to be talking about Chase and Bank of America and Morgan Stanley and all the rest with their credit default swaps and 100 other hinky products and their insane rush to privatize our government. Didn't they do more to drive us off that famous fiscal cliff than any retired firefighter or cement finisher ever could? Well, we don't want to suggest that some of those deals need to be renegotiated, but maybe they do. Well, the short answer is that this is what happens when you elect a mayor and a governor who accumulated their personal wealth at the service of these very same financial institutions. But mostly, it's what Mayor Daley always used to call contracts. In other words, their contracts are stronger than your contract, and they take higher priority than you when when yours was the one that was forged with mental health providers and public school employees and the like. This has got me all agitated because it's an article in the most recent In These Times headlined, "Why Chicago Won't Go Bankrupt and Why Detroit Didn't Have to." And it's written by our guest today, Saqib Bhatti, who's the director of Refund America and a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. And it is a pleasure to have you at the table, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Let's get right into it. Detroit. It's all about Detroit, right? Detroit went bankrupt, and now all these other cities, all of us are going to go bankrupt too. Did Detroit need to go bankrupt? You say no.
Absolutely not.
Why?
Detroit, to be fair, Detroit had lots of structural issues. But the reality is that it wasn't a foregone conclusion that bankruptcy was the way out. We've been sold this myth about Detroit, that Detroit had so many outstanding debts, $18 billion is the number that's thrown out there, that they had no choice but to go bankrupt because they couldn't possibly pay that off. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that in a municipal bankruptcy, the real issue is not your total outstanding debt, it's your shortfall for any given year. It's whether or not you can pay your bills as they come due. That's the definition of insolvency for municipalities. And for Detroit, the insolvency was about a $198 million shortfall. So even though they threw out this number that Detroit has $18 billion in debt, which by the way was a number that was very inflated because they threw in lots of stuff that wasn't actually the debt of the city of Detroit. Mm-hmm. But they threw out that number to sort of make it seem like there's a big crisis and no way out. But in reality, all they had to do was come up with $198 million to get through that pinch. I mean, again, I don't want to.
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. I don't want to minimize the broader structural issues that existed.
Right.
But $198 million was very, very doable.
So, I mean, I just help me out here. Like, put this in terms for like an ordinary human being. If I have a mortgage of $250,000, you could say that my structural deficit is $250,000, right? But yes, I owe that money, but I don't owe it in August, Right, that's the thing that and this is one of the key distinctions between a corporate bankruptcy and a municipal one. In a corporate bankruptcy, it is the case that if your total liabilities are greater than your total assets, then you're bankrupt. Mm-hmm. But that's because theoretically you can sell off a company, you can sell off all its assets, liquidate it to pay down the debts. Mm-hmm. With municipalities, you can't do that because, Detroit is not Circuit City. You can't you can't just sell it all away and then
Because if you do that, then what's going to happen to the people who live there? You can't liquidate the city.
Who's going to buy all those buses and stuff anyway, right?
Exactly.
Fire engines, right?
And so the key thing is, as you said, just like with your mortgage, if you have a $200,000 mortgage, you're not expected to pay that right now. You're not broke if you don't have $200,000 in the bank account. In fact, if you did, then you probably wouldn't have taken out the mortgage in the first place.
You just pay it, right?
You just pay it. And so it's really about whether or not you can pay your bills as they come due, one bill at a time.
And it's also true that there's nothing wrong with a city being indebted. I mean, it's not as the same thing. If it needs to rebuild its water service or something, it doesn't have that $1 billion available, so it borrows.
Right, no, that's definitely the case, which is that if you have long-term capital projects, the best way to pay them off and to finance them is through long-term debt, because then you can smooth it out over the course of many years, and you don't have to do huge payments right now when you know things will be used over the long term.
So was there a point at which financial companies, I would call them almost predators, looked at Detroit and said, this is an opportunity for us. If we liquidate this thing, maybe they did think it was Circuit City, and we can get some money out of it.
Yeah, I know. I mean, the banks played a huge role in the bankruptcy in Detroit. I mean, one of the things that we had, so we mentioned just a second ago that it makes sense to do long-term borrowing for long-term capital projects. What's a problem is when you're doing long-term borrowing for short-term cash flow.
Which we are now doing.
Which is what we're doing. It's because really what it speaks to is this issue that, well, you really need to figure out a way to raise revenue, and you're unable to do it.
Right.
And so banks come peddling your deal saying, hey, we see that you're hard up for cash, and here's a deal that you can do. In much the same way that they targeted cash-strapped homeowners who were looking to buy a mortgage, buy a home. They sold them mortgages that theoretically were great deals, but they had hidden costs, hidden risks, were really complex, and were often designed to fail. Adjustable rates.
Designed to fail. Yeah.
And Detroit got basically the municipal version of those same subprime mortgages. In 2005, 2006, they were given these, they were sold these deals that were certificates of participation, which is a fancy way of basically getting around debt limits. Detroit had a debt limit, and they couldn't issue more bonds.
Okay. All right.
And so they came up with this other structure, a certificate of participation, which basically you create a shell corporation and make it seem like you're making payments to that, and it's not really debt. And that
fascinating how things can be done when the people in charge make money off of it.
What was great was that year, or really ironic, that year the city actually got an award for one of the most innovative financing schemes because they came up with the structure, and it had variable rate debt, and it had interest rate swaps, which we also have in Chicago, and the thing was supposed to be the savior of Detroit.
And was that award from Washington Mutual or something?
I mean, it was definitely by an industry group. And down the line, those deals backfired in a really big way. They ended up costing billions more than they should have. The interest rate swaps in particular blew up fantastically. The city ended up paying, over the course of the many years since they went haywire, hundreds of millions in fees on the swaps.
Now, it's no coincidence that at this exact same time, Richard M. Daley finds his back to the wall. He's gotten himself into a lot of deals he can't pay for. He can't come up with money, and so they dangle the same things in front of him.
Exactly. No, it's basically it's what they do. They find the weak spot, and then they go over there and say, hey, here's a way for you to save some money. But of course, the thing is that if a bank comes knocking on your door saying, hey, let me save you some money, like, well, their main interest is not the taxpayers of Chicago or Detroit.
Right.
Their main interest is their shareholders.
It's the equivalent of one of those pieces of junk mail you get in the, hey,
Exactly.
I got a great deal for you. Yeah, it's like a payday loan or something.
Yeah.
You need $50, it'll only cost you $250. So the city gets into this. The city decides to mortgage its future, in essence. And then the mayor kind of figures out that maybe he doesn't want to be mayor anymore, and Emanuel comes into office. He's had 4 years. Has he materially improved the situation? He claims he has.
No, he's done more of kicking the can down the road, more of these short-term fixes, things like gimmicks like red light cameras, speeding cameras to balance the budget. He hasn't done the difficult thing that needs to be done, which is figure out how to raise progressive revenue in this city, and frankly, in the state. He needs to lobby Springfield for that as well, but he's not willing to do that because, progressive revenue means making rich people pay their fair share instead of pushing all the burden on those who can least afford it. And unfortunately, as it turns out, the rich people are some of his biggest campaign contributors.
And his friends.
And his friends.
And the people who purchased the office for him, let's be frank. I mean,
right.
He got into office because he had lots and lots and lots of money from lots and lots of very wealthy people. Many of them didn't even live in the city.
Indeed.
But this gets us to the crux of this matter, which it just makes me insane to think about this, that now you're in the difficult position of having to pay back the very people who not only structured these loans this way, but who, I don't want to say, a vast conspiracy here. It's not quite like that, but it's a combination of very wealthy people who you explain this so well in your article and in these times. Wealthy people buy bonds, right? I mean, take me through that circle all the way back around.
Right. When it comes to municipal bonds are tax exempt, which means that they tend to pay lower interest rates. And because that's the case, really you don't have major institutional investors that invest in a big way in municipal bonds. And so the main investors in muni bonds are high wealth individuals who do it because they get a tax credit. And so they do it for a tax break. And so what we have is a situation where you have the wealthy not paying their fair share in taxes. They find way, that they're already not paying their fair share. They're often they spend millions lobbying or contributing to campaigns of people who will keep their taxes down. So they're not paying their fair share. And then instead of paying that money in taxes, they're actually lending it to us because we're borrowing from them. Because they're not paying their fair share, we're not borrowing from them.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. We're
borrowing the tax dollars,
our taxes from wealthy people.
Exactly, and then we're paying it back to them with interest, and we're giving them a further tax break for lending it to us. So as you said, it's not a conspiracy, but it is a completely rigged game that's been rigged in so many ways over time. And then, of course, Wall Street banks, they have a key interest in maintaining this because they get a cut of every transaction because of the way that their industry has changed over time, where they do the deal, they sell it off, they take their cut, and because that's the case, they have an interest in selling as complex a deal as possible with as many add-ons as possible.
And because they have over time purchased the United States Congress and pretty much every state legislature, they can structure legislation that's absolutely to their liking.
Right, that's absolutely the problem.
Okay, well, thanks for coming. So that's the end of the discussion then, isn't it? There's no hope. So you say that somehow or other we have to begin to formulate legislation that backs off the Reagan Revolution. I mean, starting in 1980, we all heard government is not the, what is it?
Government's a problem, not the solution.
Government is the problem. And that the way we have to solve our problem is by strangling government. And we've been strangling it for 25 years to the point that now government can't even raise the money it needs to do the essential things that it wants to do. So it has to sell off its assets, has to sell off its parking meters or whatever it is. And when it can't come up with enough money, then these same interests criticize the government for not being able to do its job, and they say the private sector could do it so much better. Why don't you let us come in and clean your schools for you for $250 million, and we'll forget to do some of them, and we'll do a lousy job, but still you got to pay us.
No, that's the issue, that we've basically created this system, and really it's not just that we've created it, it's that we've actually let corporate interests create the system that where they get to profit off of it. They say the government's a problem, not the solution. But really, they love government. They just love to be able to take over government. They love government cash. They don't really want small government. They want big government that they get to get their hands into.
And at this point in this conversation, we could go in a million directions. I mean, I'm thinking, for-profit prison systems, right?
Right.
Same thing. It's like these are not interests that have in heart attempting to provide justice or to reduce the prison populations. They have a fiscal and vested interest in imprisoning more and more people.
Right. I mean,
And
in many
so
cases,
it goes.
Yeah, in many cases, there's actually with private prisons, there's mandatory bed counts. So you're actually required to have so many prisoners at any given point in time, which then completely skews our democracy. I mean, that's the other thing with privatization, is that it's not just that they extract money from public coffers and spend it poorly, but it also completely skews public decision making. But I mean, really, the bigger thing this all points to, though, is that we've created the system in which they create a crisis and then they profit off of it, right? They're the ones who sort of are the privatizers, the Wall Street banks, the wealthy. They're the ones who are not paying their fair share in taxes. They're lobbying to make sure 2/3 of corporations in Illinois pay no taxes, right? Which is a shocking number. Every time that you hear, Scott Walker from Wisconsin saying, well, Illinois corporations should come here. It's like, yeah, if they go there, they'll pay more taxes. And so we've created this system where the corporation's rich, they don't pay their fair share in taxes, they lobby to keep taxes down, and that's what creates the crisis that then allows them to come in with their solutions. And their version of the solution is always designed to benefit them at the expense of working people in the city and the state.
So, okay, let's get to the big issue, which is not really even the biggest issue, but it's the big issue today: pensions. We all know, of course, that the reason we're in this mess is because we pay such fat pensions to all of these greedy public employees, and they have screwed us, and we have got to do something about putting these teachers and firefighters and people in their place.
So here's an analogy I like to use with pensions. So it's basically like, imagine that you're a worker, you have a job. Your boss comes to you one day and says, listen, I don't have money to pay you this week, but I know that you have some money in savings. Is it okay if I pay you next week? And you say, okay, that's fine. Pay me next week and we'll be okay. Next week he says the same thing, and he does this for a year. At the end of the year, he now owes you $30,000. And you say, hey, I need my $30,000. And his response is, why are you so greedy? You want $30,000, right? That's the part that most people just don't get, is that
And he goes to his friend in the legislature to get some laws passed saying he doesn't have to pay you that $30,000.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the thing with pensions that people often just don't get because of the debate around this that's been shaped, which is that pensions it's actually deferred wages. It's wages that when you earn, as you're working, the same way that your employer might pay into your 401k in the private sector or pay Social Security taxes for you. They're supposed to do that with every single paycheck. Well, the state's supposed to do that too. So is the school district. So is the city. And in their case, it goes into the pensions. And what you had was that in years when there were budget crises or when there were revenue shortfalls, instead of finding ways to raise taxes, you had the city say, or the mayor, the legislature, the governor say, you know what, this year we're not going to pay. We're just going to say that we're going to take a pension holiday. A pension holiday just means not making the payments at the time that they're due.
Yes, pension holidays, yes.
And so what you actually have is that people, they worked for this already. The pensions are actually wages for work they've already done, and they don't want to pay it. And instead they want to say, well, the problem is that you have too many pensions, even though most pensioners, they don't get Social Security. And they've had modest salaries all their lives.
Yeah. Well, let's stipulate that we have probably caused a lot of physical damage to iPads and cell phones and TV sets right now from people smashing them against the walls in anger at what you and I are saying here. Because yes, it can be stipulated that there has been a lot of abuse in the pension system over the last 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 years. And we all know those examples of people who double dip and triple dip. And, it's easy to find the poster children for why pensions are bad. But as you say, the critical part about this is that the vast, overwhelming majority of them are not abusers, and that until recently, the structure was in place to pay them every penny that they needed. It wasn't hard to do. It's just that when you stop putting your side of the money in, it all goes to hell.
Right. I mean, a perfect example is Chicago Public Schools.
Isn't it?
Which up until 1995 was almost fully funded, 90% or something. And then because they were so well funded, Well, CPS decided, well, we're not going to pay you this year in 1995.
Yeah.
And they decided that in 95, 96, 97, all the way through 2005.
But let me stop you. It's the other thing that you're talking about. CPS didn't stop paying the pensions just because they're vile, evil people and they just wanted to save a few bucks or, build something that they didn't need.
Right.
They did it because they had no other options. And I think it's an important thing to say. Because of all the stuff we were talking about in the first 20 minutes of the show, their backs were against the wall. They saw this pot of money that, how could they resist, right? I mean, it's like you're a drug addict and somebody's walking by with their wallet hanging out of their pocket.
Right, that's the thing, that the issue was the CPS was broke and they needed to find a place to get the money. But, as the Chicago Teachers Union says, they were broke on purpose.
Of course.
Because the issue is that that they didn't want to raise taxes on rich people and corporations.
Right.
And of course, CPS can't do it themselves.
Can't do it themselves.
But with the help of the mayor and the governor, they definitely could have done that. And so you have this thing where pensions sort of become the easy scapegoat.
Right.
So that you can pit workers against the broader community that they serve, even though, of course, and then as long as you have, workers fighting against the broader community, then people at the top they're off the hook. No one's looking up.
And you get that false choice. It's like, well, look, we all know we're broke. We all know we have no money. So what should we do? Close a bunch of schools or screw the teachers out of their pensions? Which would you vote for?
Right.
And what's that about? And I can't help but draw this. It's probably an unfair parallel, but as we're sitting here talking today, this whole thing is happening all over the world, but particularly in Greece, also Puerto Rico, but specifically Greece, where a lot of people, 60% of them, in fact, just kind of stood up and said, "This is wrong.
It was astounding.
This is not fair." Now, again, yes, they messed up. They had lousy government. They did a lot of bad things, but they were enticed into it in the same way that CPS and the city of Chicago and the city of Detroit and the city of New Orleans and everybody else has been enticed into that situation because they were tax starved.
Right. I mean, the issue really is that that government officials get desperate if they actually, and public officials get desperate if you can't find a way to raise taxes, or if you think the political will is not there to raise taxes on the people who can afford to pay. You really run out of options, right?
Yeah.
And so when a banker comes to you and says, "Hey, here's a way to save some money," you start thinking, "Oh wow, I really need a way to save money. Well, let me try that."
Yeah. And by the way, you're into me for $3 or $4 billion in other things too. So maybe you ought to listen to me. You had a quote which I want to read back to you, because our governor, as part of his reform measures, has decided that he wants to keep half of the money that has traditionally, for decades, been shared with municipalities. He needs money too, right? He doesn't want to raise money. He doesn't raise taxes, so he's going to take it from the cities. And so the city of Chicago and the city of Rockford and the city of Peatone, everybody's going to get a 50% haircut because if Rauner gets his way. And you said, like state officials did to Detroit, Rauner inflicted financial hardship on cities and then dangled bankruptcy in front of them as the solution. And that's what we're seeing happening today.
Right. No, and I mean, that's a really sort of perverse thing that's happening, right? It also happened in Detroit, where you had the state legislature slash funding to the city by quite a bit, and then give it bankruptcy as an option to try to create the impetus for bankruptcy. And you're seeing a similar thing here, where in reality the issue is that, there's a bill that currently municipalities in Illinois cannot file bankruptcy. So under the federal bankruptcy code, municipalities, so that's cities, school districts, public agencies, can file bankruptcy, but only if the states authorize them. 26 states, including Illinois, do not authorize it. And so there's a bill in the legislature to change that. It's been proposed by Representative Sandak from Downers Grove to change that so that municipalities can file bankruptcy. And the bill is sort of seen as dead on arrival, basically. The will wasn't there to pass it. And it's part of, Rauner's been touting it as part of his turnaround agenda. And the thing is now, what he's created the situation though where he's trying to entice municipal officials to support it, But part of how he's doing that is by cutting state aid to them.
Yeah.
And so
if you're the mayor of Stone Park or something, and you've got one fire truck and it's breaking down all the time, and half of your money just went away, it's like, well, maybe if I declared bankruptcy, I could get out from under all these 8 pensions that I've got to pay, and maybe I'll be able to fix the fire truck. That's what we're up against here.
Yeah, and it's just so perverse, right? And it's one of the things that. So I was at the hearing where that bill was being, where there was a committee hearing on that bill, and so we had the mayor Larry Morrissey from Rockford, who was there speaking in support of it, and he sort of pointed to this exactly, that like the issue is that we don't have enough money, and so to be clear, he did make clear that Rockford's not in this situation. He feels that Rockford is doing fine, but that if there's not enough money coming in, that you need to be able to go after pensions as a way to make ends meet. Mm-hmm. And the whole thing just seems so off to me, because it's like, look, if you're concerned about not having enough money, you should be really pushing back against the governor, mm-hmm. who, one, is pushing these devastating cuts onto you, mm-hmm. two, refuses to restore taxes to the level they were at just 6 months ago, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? And also is really trying to cut taxes further, right? You have this crazy system in which Rauner is at the same time saying that he's going to cut state aid by 50% while also proposing further tax cuts. Yeah. It's like, well, are we in a crisis or aren't we? Mm-hmm. And if we're in a crisis, then how is that at all fiscally responsible? Mm-hmm. I mean, the issue is really that Governor Rauner, he comes from a private equity firm background. He ran a private equity firm, which, there's this book, Barbarians at the Gate, which is about private equity firms, because the business model for private equity is you go in, you just strip all the assets, extract all the value, you actually drive companies like Circuit City into mm-hmm. bankruptcy, mm-hmm. And you do all of that so you can issue a return to your investors. And of course, for him, the investors are his campaign contributors.
And if you're GTCR or whatever it was, one of our distinguished governor's company, you also, don't forget, charge them a very high fee for your services. Right. That's how you make your money, right?
Absolutely.
So around and around it goes, and it never ends. So what do you prescribe, doctor? We got like a minute and a half to hear what can we do?
I mean, we need progressive revenue solutions in this state. And so, one, we need to pass a millionaire's tax. We need to restore the corporate tax break. The corporate tax rate, the higher rate that just sunsetted. We need to start looking at a financial transactions tax to tax the transaction on LaSalle Street on the exchanges. We need to start looking at other options, like actually taking some of these bad deals that we've entered into, like interest rate mm-hmm. swaps, and actually suing the banks to get that money back, because there's a strong case that we can do that.
I wish we had more time, because that's something that really gets to me. It's like, instead of lowering our bond rating to junk, why can't we say to the banks, okay, all right, but we're good for this money. So instead of you now levying another predatory tax on top of us because our fees are going to be higher because we got junk status, hold off on that for a year until we can restructure things, and help us restructure it. Mm-hmm. Why don't you become part of the solution instead of the problem? But we can't do that.
We can't do that because they make more money by being part of the problem.
Right. Wow. We're going to have to do this some more. Will you come back again sometime?
Absolutely.
All right, okay. Saqib Bhatti from the Roosevelt Institute, and you can look him up in these times. A great piece that's in there right now. Go get it or look at it online, okay? I'm Ken Davis. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom, a rather inflammatory edition this week. And hey, we're just doing a public service, because this is a community service of CAN TV. Oh, there goes any funding we were ever hoping to get for Chicago Newsroom from Bank of America. Chicago Newsroom, presented by Bank of America. You can watch us online at this address any old time. Check us out there. You can subscribe on iTunes. If we're still around, maybe next week we'll be back with another show. I'm Ken Davis. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week, I hope. Bye.